Imagine a quiet river, surrounded by remote mountains, dense forests, and morning fog. It is January 1848. In a remote area called Coloma, California, workers are building a small mill. Among them is a man named James W. Marshall. One cold morning, while inspecting the flow of water near the mill, Marshall suddenly notices something strange. Something is shining beneath the mud. He bends down and picks up several small, yellow-colored stones. At first, he has no idea what they are, but after testing them, the truth becomes clear. They are gold, pure gold, just a few tiny pieces of yellow metal. But those tiny pieces are about to trigger one of the greatest migrations in human history. An event that will become known as. But how could a few pieces of gold cause hundreds of thousands of people to abandon their homes and travel thousands of miles toward an unknown land? Did they actually become rich? Or did someone else make the real fortune? And behind the glittering story of gold, what happened to the Native American communities who had lived in California for thousands of years? Today, we are going to uncover the story of the California Gold Rush, and how one tiny discovery changed the economic, political, and geographic future of America. In early 1848, California was not yet part of the United States. The United States was rapidly expanding westward following the Mexican-American War. In February 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed between Mexico and the United States. Under the treaty, Mexico was forced to surrender a massive amount of territory to the United States, and California was part of that territory. At the time, almost nobody knew what was hidden beneath the land. A huge amount of gold. And within just a few weeks, news of the discovery began spreading like wildfire. At first, the news spread locally. Then it reached San Francisco. From there, it spread across the United States. And eventually, the news reached Europe, Latin America, and Asia. One word was suddenly on everyone's lips. One of the most fascinating figures of the gold rush was Sam Brannan. Brannan understood something that many others did not. If people were going to California to search for gold, they would need tools, shovels, pans, picks, tents, clothing, food, and countless other supplies. Brannan didn't rush into the mountains looking for gold. Instead, he started buying up the equipment that gold seekers would need. Then one day, he walked through the streets of San Francisco carrying a bottle. Inside the bottle was gold dust. He began shouting, "Gold, gold, gold!" The city went crazy, businesses emptied, offices emptied, sailors abandoned their ships, workers left their jobs. People had only one goal: get to California and find gold. And that was when Brannan's real business began. The mining tools he had bought cheaply were suddenly worth many times their original price. He didn't become rich by digging gold out of the ground. He became rich by selling tools to people who were chasing their dreams of finding gold. In other words, he didn't sell gold. He sold the dream of finding gold. And that business helped make Sam Brannan one of the first major fortunes of the California Gold Rush. By 1849, the gold rush had reached a completely different level. Thousands of people began abandoning their homes, jobs, businesses, and families to travel toward California. They became known as the 49ers, but reaching California was not an ordinary journey. It was a dangerous expedition. There were three major routes available to them. The first was the overland route. It was roughly 2,000 miles long. Travelers had to cross enormous plains, deserts, and the Rocky Mountains using wagons, horses, and oxen. The journey could take around 6 months. Along the way, they faced disease, hunger, accidents, freezing temperatures, and extreme heat. One of the greatest threats was cholera. The second option was the Panama route. Travelers would take a ship to Panama. But the Panama Canal did not yet exist, so they had to cross the dangerous jungle on foot or by mule before reaching the Pacific coast. Disease, mosquitoes, and harsh conditions made the journey extremely dangerous. And then there was the third route. Cape Horn. Travelers with enough money could sail around the southern tip of South America and then continue toward California. The journey could take several months. The waters around Cape Horn were notoriously dangerous. Huge waves, storms, disease, and exhaustion turned the journey into a terrifying experience. But people kept coming because they believed that somewhere at the end of that journey, there was gold waiting for them. In the early days of the gold rush, some of the first arrivals really did find enormous amounts of gold. Gold could sometimes be found in riverbeds and shallow deposits. A simple pan could separate gold from dirt and gravel. For a while, it seemed almost too easy, but then hundreds of thousands of people arrived, and the easily accessible gold began disappearing. Now the work became much harder. Miners stood in freezing water for hours. They dug through mud. They broke rocks. They moved enormous amounts of dirt. They worked day after day under brutal conditions. And while the miners struggled to find gold, another problem was growing. The cost of living. California's mining towns were not prepared for such a massive population explosion. Food, clothing, tools, transportation, and housing had to be brought in from somewhere else. As demand exploded, prices skyrocketed. So even when a miner found gold, much of it could quickly disappear into the cost of food, equipment, shelter, and entertainment. And the mining towns became increasingly chaotic. There was little organized government. Law enforcement was weak. Disputes over land and mining claims were common. Violence and crime became part of everyday life in many communities. The gold rush was not simply a story of wealth. It was also a story of survival, uncertainty, and chaos. The gold rush taught one of the most important lessons in business history. Sometimes the best way to make money from a gold rush is not to search for gold, but to sell things to the people searching for it. One immigrant businessman understood this very well. His name was Levi Strauss. Mining was extremely hard on clothing. Miners needed pants that could survive constant physical labor. Strauss began producing tough work pants using durable fabric and metal rivets. The pants quickly became popular among miners. They were strong, they were practical, and they could survive the harsh working conditions of the gold fields. Eventually, this type of clothing became famous around the world as blue jeans. So the gold rush didn't just create fortunes from gold. It also helped create businesses whose influence would last for generations. The miners were searching for gold, but some businessmen were building industries. But there is a much darker side to the California gold rush. The impact on California's Native American communities was devastating. Long before the gold rush, Native American peoples had lived throughout California for thousands of years. Their communities depended on the land, rivers, forests, wildlife, and natural resources around them. Then suddenly, hundreds of thousands of newcomers arrived. They wanted land. They wanted gold. They wanted access to rivers and natural resources. Mining damaged rivers and disrupted traditional food sources. Land was taken. Conflicts increased, and native communities were pushed into an increasingly desperate situation. In 1850, the newly established California government passed legislation that severely damaged the rights of Native Americans. The system allowed Native people to be forced into labor. Children were separated from their families, and violence against Native communities became widespread. In some cases, rewards were offered for the killing of Native people. By the 1850s, much of the easily accessible gold was becoming harder to find. So miners turned to technology. One of the most destructive methods was known as hydraulic mining. The idea was simple: use enormous amounts of high-pressure water to blast away entire sections of hillsides. The soil and rocks would collapse. Then the material would be processed to extract the gold. The method could produce enormous amounts of gold, but the environmental damage was equally enormous. Millions of tons of soil, sand, rocks, and mining waste were washed into rivers. River channels became clogged. Agricultural land was damaged. Flooding became a serious problem. Farmers eventually began fighting back. They took powerful mining companies to court. And in 1884, a major court decision restricted hydraulic mining practices that were sending mining debris into rivers. It became an important moment in the history of environmental law in the United States. But by then, the damage had already been done. The landscape had been permanently altered. The rivers had been transformed, and the environmental scars of the gold rush would remain for generations. So what did the California gold rush actually do to America? First, population. California's population exploded within just a few years. Second, economic growth. The enormous amount of gold entering the economy helped strengthen the American financial system and commercial expansion. Third, Western development. California became a major center of American economic activity. In 1850, California became the 31st state of the United States. But there was still a major problem. How could California remain connected to the rest of the country? The answer eventually became one of America's greatest infrastructure projects: the Transcontinental Railroad. When the railroad was completed in 1869, travel between the eastern United States and California became dramatically faster. California was no longer an isolated frontier. It had become an essential part of America's economic future, and San Francisco, sitting on the Pacific coast, became an important gateway for American trade with Asia. The gold rush had transformed California, and California, in turn, helped transform America. On that cold morning in January 1848, James Marshall picked up a few tiny yellow stones from the mud of a California river. He probably could not have imagined what would happen next. Those tiny pieces of gold helped trigger one of the greatest migrations in history. They created new cities. They created businesses. They accelerated Western expansion. They helped connect the American continent. But they also brought exploitation, violence, environmental destruction, and catastrophe for Native American communities. And perhaps the greatest lesson of the gold rush is this: Everyone came looking for gold, but the people who often made the most lasting fortunes were the ones who understood the needs of the people searching for it. Some searched for gold, some sold shovels, some sold clothing. Some built transportation networks, and together they helped create a new economic era in America. Today, the rivers of California may no longer glitter with gold the way they once did, but the consequences of that tiny discovery are still visible, because sometimes history does not need millions of people to change.